In the small Mississippi town of Cypress Grove, where the river winds through fields of memory and loss, a quiet rebellion stirs. For too long, Sheriff Carter's iron grip has kept voices silenced and dreams buried beneath the weight of fear. But when a young black girl named Sasha dares to speak the truth and an entire community finds the courage to rise, the river itself bears witness to a transformation that cannot be stopped. This is the story of a town that chose defiance over silence, of voices long denied that rose together in a hymn of hope. It is a testament to the power of memory, the strength of unity, and the promise that no darkness can last forever. Stay with us as we journey into the heart of Cypress Grove, a place where the river remembers, and the dawn is always just beyond the night. In a small town nestled along the banks of the Mississippi, where the river's gentle flow belied the weight of unspoken stories, lived a community of black families whose laughter had grown quiet beneath the iron rule of a man named Robert Bob Carter. His name carried like a storm through the narrow streets of Cypress Grove, whispered in hushed tones behind the worn wooden doors of shotgun houses. In this town of cracked sidewalks and flickering porch lights, every morning began with the low growl of Carter's black SUV, a harbinger of dread that set hearts pounding and children's eyes to the ground. School buses rattled down dusty lanes, but the girls, like Keisha with her bright pink backpack and Janelle with her mother's old wool hat, learned to keep their heads low, to hurry their steps, to never meet Carter's gaze should he slow his vehicle and roll down the tinted window. In those moments, the river's song was drowned out by the silence of fear, a silence that seeped into every dinner table, every bedtime prayer. In the heart of this quiet terror lived Samuel Johnson, a single father with a voice as rich as the gospel choirs he had once sung in, now reduced to murmurs of comfort for his daughter Sasha. She was only 13, with dreams of becoming a teacher, her room filled with handwritten poems she dared not share. At night, Samuel would sit in the dark, his hands folded tight, listening for the crackle of Carter's radio or the scuff of boots outside. He told himself he was keeping Sasha safe, that his silence was his shield. But in the marrow of his bones, he knew it was only fear that kept him still. Carter's power was a storm cloud that never lifted. He was no ordinary sheriff. He was the law and the curse woven together, and the black folk of Cypress Grove had learned that to speak his name aloud was to invite ruin. Henry Miller, the old veteran who had fought in Korea and come home with medals and scars, once tried to stand up to tell Carter that his badge did not give him the right to lay hands on the young girls of the town. They found Henry 2 days later in a holding cell, a broken wrist and a charge of resisting arrest. His wife, Mabel, was left to gather his dignity like scattered leaves in the wind. She took down the framed photos from the mantel, too proud to let their eyes see her grief. But in Cypress Grove, grief was an old friend. Every family carried it like a birthmark, passed down from mother to daughter, father to son. And so, the children learned to keep to the shadows. In the evenings, the church bells would toll a single note, a low moan that echoed off the tin roofs and dirt roads, and the families would gather in living rooms lit by soft lamplight, their prayers stitched together in the hush between hymns. They prayed for safety, for strength, for the day Carter's grip might slip. The day never seemed to come. The schools taught reading and writing, but the girls learned another lesson: how to disappear in plain sight, how to hold their fear behind quiet eyes. Sasha would clutch her mother's worn Bible in her lap, tracing the names in the family tree, wondering if the God of her grandmother's stories still heard the cries of black girls in Mississippi. Carter's men patrolled the streets like hungry dogs. They called it law and order, but everyone knew it was just another name for keeping folks in line. The town council met in the basement of the old library, but they never spoke of Carter's raids, never questioned the bruises on a boy's cheek, or the sudden silence of a girl who used to sing in the choir. The council's leader, Pastor Elijah Jameson, would bow his head and say, "Patience, children. Change comes slow in these parts." But patience was a luxury Sasha and the others could no longer afford. At night, she dreamed of the river, of the moonlight dancing on the water like a promise. In those dreams, she ran, barefoot and breathless, toward a place where no one's voice was stolen, where the only sound was the rush of the current and the song of her own heart. But the mornings brought her back to Cypress Grove, to the narrow streets and the weight of Carter's name. She would walk past the old oak in the town square, its roots deep as the pain in her chest, and she would wonder how long she could keep her head down, before the world demanded she look up. In a faded farmhouse on the edge of town lived an old woman named Mama June, who had seen more seasons than the river itself. Her hands were gnarled from years of picking cotton and braiding her daughter's hair. She told Sasha stories of Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth, of men and women who refused to be shadows in another man's story. "You got that same fire, baby," she'd say, her voice soft as a lullaby. "Don't you let no one snuff it out." But Mama June's eyes were tired, and her voice would trail off, swallowed by the memories of nights when the clan's torches lit the sky, and her own mother had hidden her in the root cellar, whispering prayers through the floorboards. Carter wasn't the Klan, but his power came from the same well, a deep, dark place where men believed their badges made them gods. As the sun set over Cypress Grove, the river turned to liquid gold, and the cicadas sang their mournful song. Sasha stood at the window, her breath fogging the glass. She saw the SUV glide past, headlights slicing through the dusk, and she felt her pulse quicken. In the stillness, she heard the echo of Mama June's words, a whisper of courage in a world that had stolen so much. Somewhere beyond the river, beyond the fear, she believed there was a place where girls like her could walk with their heads held high. But tonight, in the hush of twilight, she pressed her hand to the cool pain and promised herself she would not be a shadow forever. In the distance, the church bell tolled once more, a low, resolute note that seemed to say, "Change comes for those who dare to dream." And so, in the soft glow of a single lamp, Sasha let her tears fall, each one a testament to the girl she refused to let the world forget. The next morning, the sun rose over Cypress Grove with the kind of fragile light that seemed almost apologetic, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalks and peeling paint of shotgun houses. Sasha woke to the sound of her father's quiet voice in the kitchen, the clink of an old coffee pot, the low hum of gospel music barely rising above the worry in his chest. Samuel's eyes were ringed with exhaustion, and as he watched his daughter step into the morning light, he felt that same old ache settle deep in his bones, an ache that came from knowing a man's silence was sometimes the only shield he could offer. At school, Sasha walked to the halls with her head down, the weight of Carter's name pressing on her shoulders like a yoke. She could feel it in every glance, every cautious whisper between girls who once giggled about boys and dances, now too afraid to laugh too loud, too afraid to be noticed. In the back of the classroom, Keisha scribbled poems in the margins of her notebook, each line a prayer she dared not speak. The teachers taught history, but it was the unwritten history of Cypress Grove that held their attention. The stories of girls pulled from sidewalks, of boys who never came home. In the afternoons when the final bell rang, Sasha would hurry home past the old oak in the square, past the market stalls where men with tired eyes sold sweet tea and collard greens, their voices hushed as Carter's SUV glided by like a specter. She would pause only long enough to glance at the memorial for Marcus Williams, his name etched in brass beneath the courthouse steps. A quiet rebellion against the lies the papers had printed about him. The night Marcus died, the air had been thick with the scent of magnolia and gunpowder, and the sky had turned red with the anger of a community that knew the truth could be buried but never silenced. Marcus's mother, Loretta, still stood vigil at the edge of the square, her shoulders stooped but her gaze unbroken, a mother's grief tempered by the steel of her resolve. In the evenings, Sasha found herself at the church, where Pastor Elijah Jameson tried to fill the void with hymns and scripture, his voice steady, but his eyes clouded by the same fear that haunted them all. "We must be patient," he would say, his fingers trembling on the pulpit. "Justice is a long road, and we must walk it together." But in the back pews, the young men of Cypress Grove clenched their fists and bit their tongues, their patience worn thin by the endless nights of sirens and broken doors. Samuel would sit beside Sasha, his hand resting on hers, and wonder how much longer he could keep pretending that patience was enough. Across town, in a small room above the general store, Mama June brewed tea that tasted of earth and old secrets, her eyes watching the door, as if expecting a knock that never came. She had seen this before, she said in her soft, weathered voice, the way power fed on silence, the way fear grew in the cracks of a broken community. "The river remembers," she would tell Sasha, her fingers tracing the rim of a chipped teacup. "It carries the voices of those who came before us. You just have to learn how to listen." Sasha would nod, but the weight of her mother's Bible in her backpack felt like a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. That night, as the sun sank behind the levee, Samuel sat on the porch with the creak of the old swing beneath him, the air thick with the scent of honeysuckle and distant rain. He watched Sasha at the window, her profile framed by the flicker of candlelight, and he thought of the dreams he used to have, dreams of a life where his daughter's laughter was not a dangerous thing. In the dark, he whispered a prayer for her safety, for the strength he feared he no longer possessed, and for the day when the river would carry them all to some place where the past no longer held them in its claws. But even as he prayed, he knew the river had its own memory, and it would take more than whispered words to wash away the blood that had been spilled on its banks. Across town, Carter sat in his office at the sheriff's station, the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead, his boots propped on the desk as he read the day's reports. To him, Cypress Grove was a kingdom built on fear and small compromises, and he its undisputed ruler. He liked the quiet of the nights, the way the shadows bent to his will, the way no one dared meet his gaze. He did not see the small fractures that had begun to spiderweb through the silence, did not hear the way the river's song had grown restless, how it lapped at the edges of his dominion like a warning. In the darkness of that night, Sasha lay in her bed and listened to the wind whisper through the cracks in the walls, her heart beating a steady drum of defiance she didn't yet know she had. She thought of Marcus, of the old oak in the square, of the way Mama June's voice sounded like the hush before a storm. She closed her eyes and saw the river, wide and unbroken, shimmering beneath the moon, and in that quiet vision, she found a flicker of courage. Outside, the cicadas sang their mournful hymn, and the town slept beneath a sky thick with memory. But in Sasha's dreams, the river ran clear and strong, and she promised herself, once more, she would not be a shadow forever. In the morning, the sun would rise again over Cypress Grove, and with it, the first crack of dawn in a darkness that had lasted too long. In the pale light of dawn, the town of Cypress Grove stirred awake with the reluctant sigh of a community too used to surviving. The children's footsteps echoed on the wooden floors of the old schoolhouse, each step a quiet plea for normalcy in a world where safety was a myth, wrapped in empty promises. Sasha walked to school that morning with her books pressed tight against her chest, her mother's Bible hidden between dog-eared notebooks, the weight of its words a quiet rebellion in the hollow of her ribcage. As she passed the small grocery store where old men sat on crates, their weathered hands folded like prayers in their laps, she saw their eyes flicker to Carter's SUV parked across the street. No one spoke his name, but the name itself was a presence, thick and suffocating, a word that tasted of gunmetal and old blood. Keisha caught up with her in the hallway, her breath ragged from running, her eyes wide with something that wasn't just fear, it was a question, an accusation, and a plea for forgiveness all at once. "Did you hear?" she whispered, her voice a broken thread of sound. "They took Aaliyah's brother last night. Said he was stealing. Mama June says it's a lie." Sasha swallowed the lump in her throat and shook her head, her fingers clutching her books like a shield. The girls walked on in silence, their shoulders brushing in the crowded hallway where no one dared to speak above a murmur. In the classroom, the teacher's voice was a dull drone against the thunder of Sasha's thoughts. Outside the window, the river glimmered in the morning light, its slow curvette a reminder of something older and deeper than fear. She imagined the river carrying every whispered name, every unspoken prayer, out to the sea, far beyond the reach of Carter and his night raids. But here, in this room that smelled of chalk and stale dreams, the river was just a ribbon of light on the horizon. During recess, Sasha sat under the magnolia tree at the edge of the playground, her back pressed to the rough bark, her eyes tracing the patterns of light that flickered through the leaves. She thought of Marcus, of the way he had walked down Main Street with his head high, his laughter echoing off the brick walls, a bright sound that had once made her believe in mornings without fear. She wondered if he had felt the weight of the silence even then, if he had known that every smile was a risk, every word a tightrope over an abyss of consequence. The children played in the dirt nearby, their laughter soft and cautious, like they knew even the smallest joy could be stolen in a heartbeat. Sasha closed her eyes and tried to remember the last time she had laughed without looking over her shoulder. At home, Samuel waited by the window, his coffee cold in his hands, the morning paper unopened on the table beside him. He watched the street for signs of Carter's patrol, for the flicker of those headlights that meant trouble, had come calling again. He thought of the night Marcus died, of the way the town had held its breath as the gunshots echoed across the water, and he felt the old anger stir in his chest, a slow-burning coal he had tried to smother for years. He wanted to protect Sasha, to keep her safe from the world's sharp edges, but he knew there were some battles no father's love could fight alone. In the afternoon, the church bell rang out across the town, its voice steady and solemn, calling the faithful to evening prayer. Pastor Elijah Jameson stood in the pulpit, his hands trembling on the worn wood, his voice steady even as the shadows in the room seemed to lean closer. "We gather tonight in the name of hope," he said, his gaze sweeping over the bowed heads of his congregation. "We gather because even in the darkest night there is a promise of dawn." But Sasha saw the way his knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the pulpit, the way his voice wavered on the word hope, like he was trying to convince himself as much as them. She sat with her father in the back pew, her hand in his, and felt the slow, steady beat of his pulse, an anchor in the shifting tide of her fear. Outside the church, the river sang its quiet song in the darkness, and the wind carried the scent of rain and magnolia, a promise of renewal that felt almost cruel in its beauty. That night, as she lay in bed with the shadows creeping across the walls, Sasha thought of Mama June's stories, of Harriet and Sojourner, of the women who had walked through fire and refused to be silenced. She wondered if their spirits watched over her now, if they whispered in the hush between her heartbeats, "Child, your voice is your birthright. Do not let them steal it." She clutched her mother's Bible to her chest and let the tears come, hot and silent in the darkness. Outside, the cicadas sang their midnight hymn, and the river moved beneath the moonlight, carrying the weight of 100 stolen voices out to the sea. But in Sasha's heart, a seed of defiance had begun to take root, small and fragile, but alive, and she promised herself once more, with the quiet ferocity of a prayer, she would not be a shadow forever. The days that followed were heavy with an uneasy stillness, as if the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for something to shatter the fragile calm. Sasha walked through her neighborhood with each step a measured act of survival, her eyes tracing the cracks in the pavement, her ears attuned to every distant hum of Carter's patrol. At the corner store, old men sat beneath the flickering neon sign, their voices low and wary, the conversations weaving around the name they never dared to speak. They talked about the weather, about the river's slow rise after the last storm. But in the spaces between their words lay the weight of all they could not say. Carter's power was a silent pact, enforced by the unspoken fear that lived in every breath, every glance. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Samuel came home with his shoulders slumped and his eyes shadowed by worry. Sasha watched him from the doorway, her hands still damp from washing dishes, and she felt the air shift around him, the heaviness of news he did not yet have the words to share. He sat at the table, his fingers drumming a slow, nervous rhythm against the worn wood, and when he finally spoke, his voice was a raw whisper. "They took Henry," he said, the words tasting of disbelief and fury. "Said he was stealing from the mill. But, you know Henry, he's too proud for that." Sasha swallowed hard, her heart stuttering in her chest. She remembered Henry's smile, the way he always had a kind word for her when she passed his porch. She imagined him now, alone in a cold cell, his dignity stripped away like the paint on the church doors after too many winters. In the quiet that followed her father's words, Sasha felt something shift inside her, a slow, simmering anger that tasted of iron and salt. That night, she sat by her window long after the last light had faded from the sky, her breath clouding the glass as she watched the river slip past beneath the moon's silver gaze. She thought of the stories Mama June had told her, of women who had sung freedom songs in the darkness, their voices rising like prayer, like prophecy. She wondered if those songs still lived in the air, if they waited for a voice brave enough to set them free. Across town, Pastor Elijah Jameson knelt alone in the empty church, the flickering candlelight painting shadows on his face. He prayed for strength, for courage, for the words to heal the wounds he saw deepening in the hearts of his people. But even as he prayed, he felt the weight of his own doubt pressing against his ribs. How long could he preach patience when the world was demanding action? In the quiet of the sanctuary, the creak of the old pews sounded like the sighs of the dead, and he wondered if the river outside remembered the names of all who had suffered in silence. The next day, a flyer appeared on the door of the church, a single sheet of paper that carried the weight of generations. Community meeting, it read in bold letters. Tomorrow at dusk, all voices welcome. Sasha saw it when she walked home from school, the paper rippling in the wind like a banner of hope. She felt the whisper of something rising in her chest, a spark of defiance that tasted of possibility. That night, Samuel paced the small kitchen, his footsteps a steady drumbeat on the linoleum. "It's too dangerous," he said, his voice tight with the memory of the night Marcus died. "Carter doesn't care about meetings. He'll shut it down before it even begins." But Sasha looked at him with eyes that had seen too much and yet refused to turn away. "Maybe," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of her ancestors' songs. "But maybe it's time he saw that we're not afraid anymore." In the hush that followed, Samuel saw the ghost of her mother in the set of her jaw, the quiet fire in her gaze. He wanted to shield her from the world's cruelties, to hold her safe in the circle of his arms, but he knew that some battles could not be fought by a father's love alone. And so, when the sun dipped low the next evening, the people of Cypress Grove gathered beneath the old oak in the square. The air was thick with the scent of honeysuckle and sweat, the low hum of voices weaving a tapestry of fear and hope. Sasha stood among them, her heart beating a steady drum in her chest, her hands clenched at her sides. Pastor Elijah stepped forward, his eyes sweeping the crowd with a quiet determination. "We are here tonight," he said, his voice strong despite the tremor that ran beneath it, "because we will not be silenced, because the river remembers every name, every prayer, every injustice." The crowd murmured in agreement, a low rumble that grew with every word. Sasha felt it in her bones, the way the ground seemed to shift beneath her feet, the way the air itself seemed to hum with the promise of change. She thought of Henry in his cell, of Marcus's laughter echoing down Main Street, of the way her own voice had trembled the first time she dared to speak. And in that moment, she understood that fear was not the end of the story. It was the beginning. As the meeting drew to a close, a hush fell over the square, a breath held in the darkness. Sasha looked around at the faces lit by the soft glow of lanterns, faces etched with grief and resolve, with the quiet defiance of those who had nothing left to lose. And she knew, in the marrow of her bones, that this was only the beginning. Outside the circle of light, the river moved in the darkness, carrying the weight of every whispered promise. In its quiet song, Sasha heard the echo of her own heart, a vow whispered into the night. She would not be a shadow forever. The dawn that broke over Cypress Grove the next day carried with it a charge in the air, an undercurrent of something restless, something alive. Sasha woke with the weight of that meeting still singing in her chest, the memory of flickering lanterns and quiet, determined faces weaving through her dreams. She dressed in silence, her fingers lingering on the frayed collar of her blouse, feeling the pulse of her own heart beneath her ribs, like a secret waiting to be spoken aloud. Outside, the town moved with a nervous energy, as if everyone had caught the scent of change on the wind, but was still too wary to name it. In the narrow lanes between sagging houses, women swept their stoops with more purpose than usual, and children played beneath the watchful eyes of grandmothers who had seen too many promises broken, and still hoped for one that might hold. Carter's SUV moved through these streets like a black shark in shallow water, its presence a constant reminder that power had teeth and would not be easily dislodged. But as it rolled past, Sasha saw something she hadn't noticed before. A flicker of unease in the set of Carter's jaw, a twitch in the hand that rested on the wheel. She wondered if he too had heard the whispers growing in the dark, if he could sense the ground shifting beneath his boots. At school, the usual hush of fear seemed thinner, worn at the edges by the quiet rebellion that had taken root the night before. Keisha found Sasha in the hallway between classes, her eyes bright with something fierce. "Did you hear?" she asked, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "They're talking about another meeting, this time at the church." Sasha nodded, her own pulse quickening at the thought. In the classroom, the teachers taught their lessons with the same weary patience, but their eyes flickered to the windows more often now, as if they too were listening for something beyond the drone of chalk on blackboards. That afternoon, Sasha walked home with her head high, her gaze steady on the horizon where the river met the sky. She thought of the stories Mama June had shared, of women who had turned their voices into weapons sharp enough to cut through the thickest silence. She thought of Harriet Tubman's midnight journeys, of Sojourner Truth's thunderous words, and she wondered if those spirits walked beside her now, if they watched over Cypress Grove with the same defiance that burned in her chest. At home, Samuel sat at the table with the newspaper spread before him, his brow furrowed as he read the latest report, a story of another incident, another young black man taken in the night, another lie wrapped in the thin skin of official language. He looked up at Sasha as she entered, his eyes tired but clear. "They're trying to make us forget," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the air between them, trying to bury the truth in headlines and half-truths. "But we remember. We always remember." Sasha sat beside him, her hand finding his in the hush of the kitchen, the two of them sharing a silence that was not fear this time, but something harder, something that tasted of resolve. That night, the church filled once more with the quiet murmur of voices, voices that had grown stronger in the darkness, voices that refused to be stilled. Pastor Elijah stood at the front, his hands resting on the worn wood of the pulpit, his voice weaving a prayer into the air like a spell. "We are not here to ask," he said, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "We are here to claim our dignity, our voices, our right to be seen." The congregation murmured in response, a low, steady sound that rose like a tide. Sasha felt it wash over her, felt it anchor her to the earth beneath her feet. She thought of Marcus, of Henry still locked away, of the way Carter's eyes had flickered when he passed her on the street. She felt her mother's Bible in her backpack, its weight a promise she carried in the hollow of her spine. And in that moment, she understood that the river's song was not just a memory, it was a prophecy. Outside, the night pressed close around the church, the wind carrying the scent of magnolia and something sharper, something that tasted of rain and revolution. In the darkness, Carter sat in his office, the glow of the lamp casting deep shadows across his face. He read the reports from his deputies, each line an attempt to hold back the rising tide. But even he could feel it now, the way the town seemed to lean into the wind, the way the river's slow murmur had turned into a restless chant. He poured himself a drink with hands that trembled just slightly, and told himself he was still in control, but deep down, he knew the lie of it. In the morning, the sun rose over Cypress Grove with a brilliance that felt almost defiant, the light glinting off the river like the promise of a new day. Sasha watched it from her window, her breath fogging the glass, and she felt the seed of courage in her chest begin to sprout. She knew there would be more nights of fear, more battles to fight, but in that moment, with the dawn breaking over the town, she made herself another promise. She would not be a shadow forever. And this time, she was certain that the river was listening. The next few days unfolded with a kind of charged quiet, like the air before a summer storm. Cypress Grove breathed in unison, each inhale heavy with the weight of centuries, each exhale a defiance that was growing louder with every heartbeat. Sasha moved through the town like a girl reborn. She walked with her shoulders back and her eyes level, her mother's Bible still in her bag, but no longer hidden. She carried it like a talisman, a shield against the darkness that still prowled the edges of every street. Word of the meeting had spread beyond the pews of the church, carried in the hush of whispered conversations, and the bright eyes of children who saw, for the first time, that fear could be answered with courage. Old men who had spent their lives bent over fields straightened their spines just a little. Mothers who had learned to bite back every word of protest spoke softly but firmly to their daughters about the power of a voice. And in the river's slow, sinuous song, the town heard a promise that no matter how long the night, the sun always rises. But Carter, perched in his office like a spider in its web, felt the change too. He saw it in the way people no longer dropped their gaze when he passed, in the murmured words he could not quite catch, but knew were not prayers of obedience. His SUV still prowled the streets, but the silence that once parted before it like water was now fractured, hairline cracks of rebellion that would one day split wide open. That night, Carter called a meeting of his own. His deputies gathered in the cramped office, the stale scent of sweat and old coffee thick in the air. He paced as he spoke, his boots thudding against the cracked linoleum, each step a denial of the fear he felt blooming in the hollow of his chest. "They think they can challenge me," he said, his voice a low snarl. "They forget who keeps order in this town." But even as he spoke, he saw the flicker of uncertainty in the eyes of the men he commanded. Fear was a fragile thing. Once broken, it could not be mended, and he felt the first tremors of that breaking in the restless glances they exchanged. Meanwhile, Sasha sat at Mama June's table, the old woman's hands moving slowly over the worn cloth as she poured tea that smelled of earth and memory. "Child," Mama June said, her voice a soft rasp, "the river's been here longer than any man's rule. It's seen every sin, every secret, and it still flows. You remember that when the night seems too long?" Sasha nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of the chipped teacup. She thought of the river winding its way through the fields, of the moonlight turning its waters to silver, of the way it carried the names of the dead and the hopes of the living alike. And in that quiet, she found a strength that was older than fear. The next evening, as the sun burned low in the sky and the air turned thick with the scent of rain, Sasha walked down to the river's edge. She stood barefoot in the cool mud, the water lapping at her toes like a whispered promise. She thought of Marcus, of Henry locked in a cell for a crime he did not commit, of the girls who no longer laughed in the schoolyard. She closed her eyes and let the river's song wash over her, a litany of memory and resolve. In the distance, she heard the low rumble of Carter's SUV, but this time, she did not flinch. Instead, she lifted her chin and stared out at the horizon, where the last light of day set the water ablaze with gold. And in that moment, she knew that the river was not just a witness, it was an ally. It had carried the weight of every lie Carter had told, every cruelty he had inflicted, and it would carry her voice too, if she was brave enough to speak. She turned and walked back up the bank, her feet leaving wet prints in the dark earth. She knew there would be nights when the fear would rise again, cold and sharp in her throat. But she also knew that courage was not the absence of fear. It was the choice to keep walking anyway. As she stepped onto the road, the wind stirred the branches of the old oak, and she heard the river whisper her name, Sasha, a promise, a prayer. And she whispered back, her voice steady and sure, "I will not be a shadow forever." The following morning broke with a sky the color of bruised steel, clouds hanging low and heavy over Cypress Grove. The wind carried the scent of rain and something else, something electric, as if the very air itself was waiting to be struck. Sasha woke to the soft murmur of the river in the distance, its patient song a balm to the restless ache in her chest. She rose from her bed and stood at the window, watching as the first drops of rain pattered against the glass like the beat of a distant drum. Downstairs, Samuel moved with a quiet deliberation, the lines on his face etched deeper than ever. He poured coffee with hands that trembled just slightly, his mind replaying every word he'd heard in the whispered conversations of the night before. He had always been a man of caution, but he knew there were times when even the quietest soul must find his voice. At the schoolhouse, the children gathered in the narrow hallways, their eyes bright with something that looked almost like hope. Keisha pressed a slip of paper into Sasha's hand, her voice a hushed tremor. "Another meeting," she said. "Tonight, at the old barn by the river." Sasha nodded, feeling the paper like a brand against her palm. The words inked there a map to something bigger than any of them had dared to dream. The barn had been abandoned for years, its weathered boards and rusted hinges a relic of a time when Cypress Grove had been a town of farmers and fishermen instead of fear and silence. But that night, it was alive with voices, soft at first, then swelling like the river after a storm. Lanterns cast flickering light on the faces of men and women who had learned to live with bent spines and bitten tongues. And in that light, Sasha saw something new, the quiet, steady glow of determination. Pastor Elijah stood at the front, his eyes weary but alight with something fierce. "We are here tonight," he said, his voice low but unwavering, "because we remember who we are. Because we remember who they tried to make us forget." A murmur ran through the crowd, a ripple of agreement that felt like the first breath after too long underwater. Sasha stood among them, her heart a steady drum in her chest, and for the first time, she felt the power of her own name, the way it fit into the river of voices that rose around her. Outside, the rain began to fall in earnest, drumming on the roof in a rhythm that seemed to echo the pulse of the town itself. Carter's SUV prowled the edge of the fields, its headlights cutting through the darkness like knives. But inside the barn, the people of Cypress Grove stood shoulder to shoulder, their voices low but unbroken, their fear transmuted into something harder, something that glowed like embers in the night. Mama June was there too, her eyes bright as she clasped Sasha's hand. "Child," she whispered, her voice a tremor of memory and promise, "this is what they fear. Not our anger, but our togetherness. Not our voices alone, but our voices joined. And in that moment, Sasha understood. The river was not just water and silt and old songs. It was every story that had ever been silenced, every name that had ever been forgotten, and it would carry their defiance as far as they were brave enough to let it. As the rain hammered the roof and the wind howled through the cracks in the walls, the voices in the barn rose higher, weaving a hymn of resistance that was as old as the earth and as new as the first cry of a child. Outside, Carter watched with narrowed eyes, his hands clenched on the wheel, the cold certainty of his own power flickering in the face of a truth he could not crush. And in the river's patient murmur, Sasha heard the echo of a promise. "We will not be shadows forever." She lifted her chin and joined her voice to the chorus, her words a quiet thunder in the dark. "We remember," she said, her breath fogging in the cold. "We are not alone." And the river, endless and unbroken, carried her words out into the night, a testament to the storm that was coming and the dawn that would follow. The storm that night cracked the sky open with streaks of lightning that flashed across the fields like a warning, the thunder a deep rolling growl that seemed to rattle the bones of the old town. Cypress Grove lay beneath a mantle of rain, the river swollen and restless, as if it too could feel the surge of something building in the dark. In the barn, Sasha stood shoulder to shoulder with Keisha and Mama June, their faces turned to Pastor Elijah as he spoke in a voice that cut through the roar of the storm like a blade. "We have lived with our heads down," he said, his words measured and heavy with the weight of history. "We have lived in the shadows of men who thought their badges made them gods. But we are the children of rivers and fields, of laughter and loss. And tonight we remember that the river never forgets." A murmur rose, low and fierce, a hum of agreement that tasted of thunder and old grief. Sasha felt it in her chest, a heat that burned away the chill of the rain. She thought of Marcus, of Henry in his cell, of the girls who had learned to keep their heads down and their voices low. She thought of her father, his shoulders bowed beneath the weight of too many nights spent listening for the footfalls of Carter's men. And in that heat, she felt the first spark of something wild and unstoppable. Outside, Carter watched from the darkness, his eyes narrow slits of suspicion. He had built his power on the silence of this town, on the fear that seeped into every crack and corner. But tonight, he saw that silence splintering like old wood beneath the weight of something stronger. He clenched the wheel of his SUV until his knuckles went white, the cold bite of the metal a reminder of the control he thought was his by right. He told himself they would scatter like leaves in the wind when he pushed back, that the river would swallow their voices like it always had. But deep down, he felt it too, the river's memory stirring, the taste of his own fear sharp on his tongue. As the meeting drew to a close, Pastor Elijah stepped down from the makeshift pulpit, his eyes sweeping the gathered faces. "This is just the beginning," he said softly. "The night will try to swallow us, but we will be the light they cannot snuff out." Sasha walked home that night with the rain lashing her face and the thunder in her bones, her Bible clutched tight against her chest. Her father waited on the porch, his face pale with worry, but when he saw her, he did not scold. He simply pulled her into his arms, his embrace a fortress against the cold. "I heard them," he whispered, his voice rough with pride and fear. "I heard your voice in that barn." She pressed her cheek to his chest and felt the steady beat of his heart, the same rhythm that echoed in her own veins. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said, and in that moment, she meant it with every fiber of her being. That night, as the storm raged on, Sasha lay awake in her bed, the river's song threading through the roar of the rain. She thought of the faces in the barn, of the way their voices had joined like tributaries feeding into something vast and unbreakable. She thought of the river itself, endless and patient, carrying the weight of every story, every loss, every hope. And she promised herself, her voice a vow whispered into the darkness, "I will not be a shadow forever." Outside, the river rose and rose, its current swift and strong as if it too had found its voice. And in the hush that followed the storm's passing, Cypress Grove lay quiet and listening. The first light of dawn, a soft promise on the horizon, dot. When the dawn finally broke over Cypress Grove, it did so with a hush that felt almost holy, as if the storm had scrubbed the air clean and left behind the faint glimmer of possibility. The river glistened in the morning light, its banks swollen and eager, carrying the stories of the night before out into the world beyond the town. Sasha woke to the scent of rain and earth, her heart still beating with the echo of voices in the barn. She dressed in silence, every movement deliberate, her hands steady even as her mind buzzed with the weight of what was coming. Outside, the streets were slick with rainwater, puddles reflecting the pale sky like broken mirrors. She passed the old men on the porch of the grocery store, their eyes following her with something new, respect, or perhaps the first flicker of hope. In the schoolhouse, the children whispered in corners, their eyes wide and bright. Keisha caught Sasha's gaze and grinned, a small secret smile that felt like the promise of tomorrow. But even in the warmth of that moment, there was an undercurrent of unease, a tension that ran like a wire beneath the laughter and shared glances. Carter had not shown himself that morning, but everyone felt his presence like a cold hand at the back of the neck. Sasha knew the meeting in the barn had been a spark, but she also knew that sparks could draw the eye of those who would see them snuffed out. At home, Samuel moved through the rooms with a deliberate calm, his hands lingering on the worn Bible on the mantel, his gaze distant as if he were listening for footsteps in the quiet. He said little, but Sasha saw the way his shoulders squared when he caught her watching, the silent vow in his eyes that he would stand with her when the time came. That evening, as the sun sank behind the trees and the river glowed with the last light of day, Pastor Elijah knocked softly at their door. He looked tired, the lines in his face deepened by worry, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "They're planning another raid," he said, his words measured and grave. "Carter's men are restless. They think they can break us before we rise." Samuel's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "Let them come," he said, his voice low and fierce. "We've been quiet too long." Sasha felt the words like a brand against her skin, the heat of them chasing away the last shadows of doubt. She knew there would be danger. She could feel it in the hush that fell over the house, in the way the river seemed to hold its breath outside her window, but she also knew that there were some things worth risking everything for. That night, as the town slept, Sasha sat by the window, the moonlight turning the river to liquid silver. She thought of the barn, of the voices rising together in the dark, of the way fear had begun to crack and splinter under the weight of their defiance. She thought of the old stories Mama June had told her, of Harriet's midnight journeys and Sojourner's thunderous voice, of the way the river had carried those stories forward even when the world tried to forget. And she whispered into the darkness, her breath fogging the cold glass, her voice steady and sure, "I will not be a shadow forever." Outside, the river moved with a quiet urgency, its current swift and sure. In its depths, it carried the promise of something new, something stronger than fear, deeper than silence. And as Sasha closed her eyes, she knew the river would remember. It always did. The following night fell like a shroud over Cypress Grove, thick with the scent of wet earth and the tang of river mist. The town held its breath in the gathering dark, every window shuttered, every door locked against the weight of what was coming. In the small house by the river, Sasha sat with her father at the kitchen table, the silence between them heavy with the unspoken truth, that there were moments in every life when a choice must be made, and tonight was one of them. Samuel's hands rested on the table, calloused and strong, but she saw the way his knuckles whitened with every distant sound, a car door slamming, a dog's bark echoing down the empty street. Outside, the river murmured its old song, patient and unbroken, and Sasha clung to that sound like a lifeline. "You know you don't have to go," Samuel said at last, his voice low, his eyes dark with the memory of too many nights spent in fear. But Sasha lifted her chin, her voice steady, as she answered, "I know. But I can't stay silent anymore." And in that moment, something in his gaze shifted, a quiet surrender to the fire he saw in her eyes, the same fire that had once burned in his own. Pastor Elijah had called another gathering at the church, a final stand before the dawn that might bring either freedom or ruin. As Sasha walked the rain-slick streets toward that beacon of flickering light, she felt the weight of every footstep like the beat of a drum in her chest. The river's song followed her, a quiet promise that she would not walk alone. In the church, the air was thick with incense and sweat, the pews filled with faces etched in shadow and resolve. Pastor Elijah stood at the pulpit, his voice low but clear. "Tonight," he said, "we stand not as beggars but as witnesses. We stand for the ones whose voices were stolen, for the ones who still dare to dream." A murmur of assent rose, soft but sure, and Sasha felt it thread through her like a current of light. She thought of Marcus's laughter, of Henry's quiet dignity, of the girls who had learned to walk with their eyes downcast, but whose spirits had never been truly bowed. She thought of her mother's Bible, of the words that had been whispered in secret prayers and shouted in midnight hymns, and she felt them all gathering in her chest like a chorus. Outside, the sound of engines rumbled down the narrow streets. Carter's SUV, the deputies' trucks, their lights cutting through the darkness like knives. But inside the church, there was only the murmur of voices rising in defiance, a song older than fear, older even than the river itself. Mama June stood in the aisle, her hands clasped tight around the worn wooden cross that had been her mother's, her voice a steady anchor in the gathering storm. "Child," she said softly to Sasha, "no matter what happens tonight, remember, the river carries every story, and yours is not done yet." As the doors of the church burst open and the cold night air swept in, Sasha rose to her feet, her head held high, her voice strong. "I will not be a shadow," she said, the words a quiet thunder in the hush. "Not tonight, not ever again." And as Carter stepped into the light, his eyes hard and cold, she met his gaze without flinching, her heart a drumbeat in the dark. The river outside rose with the night, its song a promise and a prayer, and in that moment, Cypress Grove stood on the edge of something vast and unbreakable. The storm had come, and with it, the first light of a new day. As Carter's boots crossed the worn wooden threshold of the church, the air seemed to crackle with the tension of 1,000 unspoken words. His eyes swept the room like the beam of a searchlight, pausing on each face as if to weigh their worth. His lips curled in the half-smile of a man who believed the world would always bend to his will. The deputies flanked him, their hands resting on holstered guns, their presence a silent threat that pressed against the walls like a second skin. But the voices in the church did not falter. They rose in a low hum, a river of defiance that ran deeper than any badge or bullet. Sasha stood tall in the front pew, her heart a thunder in her chest, her eyes locked on Carter's as he approached the pulpit. She felt the weight of every story that had been silenced in this town, every girl who had learned to walk in the shadows, every boy who had been told to bow his head and hold his tongue. And she felt those stories gather in her throat, sharp and bright as broken glass. Pastor Elijah stepped forward, his voice calm but unyielding. "Sheriff Carter," he said, his words ringing out like the peal of a church bell, "you may wear the badge, but tonight you are the one on trial." Sid Carter's smile flickered, and for the first time, Sasha saw it. The crack in his armor, the flicker of doubt that flared in his eyes before he buried it beneath the steel of his voice. "You think this little gathering changes anything?" he said, his words dripping with contempt. "You think your hymns and your prayers will protect you?" But Mama June's voice rose from the back of the church, steady as the river. "It's not the prayers that protect us," she said, her hands clasped around the wooden cross. "It's the truth. And tonight, the truth walks with us." A murmur ran through the pews, a wave of courage that broke over Sasha's skin like fire. She stepped forward, her voice clear and unwavering. "You have tried to silence us," she said, her words a bright blade in the darkness. "You have tried to make us forget who we are. But the river remembers, and so do we." Carter's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening, but Sasha did not look away. She felt her father's hand on her shoulder, the steady weight of his love, an anchor in the storm. She felt the strength of Pastor Elijah's voice, the quiet power of Mama June's faith, the river's endless song in her blood, and she knew, in that moment, that fear was not enough to break them. Carter took another step forward, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. The room held its breath, the hush so complete it was as if the walls themselves were listening. But before he could speak, a voice rang out from the doorway, a new voice, clear and authoritative. "That's enough, Sheriff." The crowd turned as a tall black man stepped into the light, his suit damp from the rain, his eyes hard and unyielding. He held up a badge, its gleam catching the flicker of lantern light. "Elijah Grant," he said, his voice as calm as a winter morning. "Federal oversight, effective immediately." A gasp rippled through the church, the weight of his words like the sudden crack of a breaking dam. Carter's face went pale, his hand dropping from his gun as he stared at the badge, the symbol of a power he could not bend to his will. "You have no authority here," he snarled, but his voice was hollow now, the conviction gone. "I have the authority of the law," Elijah Grant said, his voice steady. "And tonight, the law stands with the people of Cypress Grove." In that moment, the church erupted in a chorus of relief and disbelief, the dam of silence finally giving way to a flood of voices that rose in a song of hope and triumph. Carter's shoulders sagged, the last of his defiance washing away in the face of the river he could no longer hold back. And Sasha, standing in the light of that new dawn, felt the chains that had bound her heart for so long shatter like glass. She reached for her father's hand, and together they joined their voices to the chorus, their song a promise to the river, to the memory of all who had come before, and to the future that waited beyond the darkness. We will not be shadows forever. And outside, beneath the soft glow of the moon, the river flowed on, endless and unbroken, carrying the stories of Cypress Grove out into the waiting world. The first light of dawn crept over the rooftops of Cypress Grove, turning the rain-washed streets to rivers of gold. The town that had once cowered beneath the weight of Carter's rule now seemed to breathe again, each window glowing with the soft light of a new day. In the old church, the voices of the night still echoed in the air, woven into the very walls like a hymn of resilience. Sasha stood on the steps, her face lifted to the pale sun, her breath a prayer of gratitude and promise. Around her, the people of Cypress Grove emerged from the shadows, mothers holding their children close, fathers with heads held high, elders who had seen too many storms, but never one that ended with the promise of dawn. Mama June walked slowly to the river's edge, her hands wrapped around the wooden cross, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "It's over," she whispered, her voice a tremor of relief and triumph. "It's over, and we're still here." Pastor Elijah stood beside her, his face lined with exhaustion and something else, something like peace. "It's only the beginning," he said softly, his eyes on the river as it flowed past, carrying the last echoes of the night away on its patient current. "But it's a beginning we claimed for ourselves." Sasha felt the truth of his words settle in her bones, a quiet certainty that would carry her forward long after the memory of this night had faded. She thought of Marcus, of Henry still waiting in his cell, of the girls who would walk to school tomorrow, with their heads held high and their voices strong. She thought of the river, how it had always carried the weight of their pain, and now carried the promise of their future. And she knew, with a fierce and steady faith, that no matter what lay ahead, they would meet it together. Beside her, her father took her hand, his grip warm and sure. He had been her shield and her shelter for so long, but today she felt his strength flow into her like the river itself, steady and unbreakable. "You did it," he said quietly, his voice thick with pride. "You stood your ground, and you didn't let the darkness take you." She turned to him with a small, weary smile. "We all did," she said, her voice soft but certain. "We stood together, and we'll keep standing." In the distance, the sound of children's laughter rose like a song, bright and clear as the morning sky. The school doors would open soon, and the girls who had learned to walk with their eyes down would find the courage to lift their heads. The men and women who had whispered their truths in the dark would speak them aloud in the light, and the river would carry it all, every word, every promise, out into the wide world beyond Cypress Grove. As the sun climbed higher, Sasha stepped down from the church steps and walked toward the water, her steps light and sure. She paused at the river's edge, the soft rush of water over stone, a lullaby that had never stopped singing, even in the darkest nights. She closed her eyes and let the sound fill her, the murmur of memory and hope and the quiet certainty of a people who had found their voice. "I will not be a shadow forever," she whispered, her words a vow to the river, to herself, to every soul who had ever been told to be silent. And in the hush that followed, she felt the river's reply in the steady pull of its current, in the way it flowed on without end, endless and unbroken, a testament to the power of voices joined and the promise of dawn. Together they turned from the river and walked back into the heart of Cypress Grove, their steps light, their eyes bright, their voices ready to shape a world that had tried to keep them in the dark. And in the quiet morning, the river flowed on, carrying their stories out into the sunlit world, a living testament to the truth that had finally been set free. As the river carries the last echoes of fear and silence out into the waiting world, Cypress Grove stands tall, no longer a place of hushed voices and hidden truths, but a testament to the power of unity and the unbreakable spirit of those who refuse to be shadows. Sasha's journey, and the journey of every soul who found the courage to rise, is a reminder to us all that even in the deepest darkness, there is always a flicker of light waiting to be kindled. If this story moved you, if you see the strength of these voices in your own story, let us know in the comments below. Share your thoughts, your hopes, and your memories, because the river of voices is stronger when it carries us all. And if you want to join us in bringing these powerful stories to life, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Together we will keep the promise. We will not be shadows forever.